Hello and welcome to tonight's event, Loving versus Virginia, a conversation with Dr. Peter Wallenstein. Tonight, Tricia Walker, manager of Alexandria Library's Local History Special Collections branch, will interview Dr. Wallenstein about his book, Race, Sex, and Freedom to Marry. They will discuss the case of Loving versus Virginia, civil rights, and marriage equality. There will be time for audience questions during tonight's conversation. If you would like to submit an audience question for Dr. Wallenstein, you may do so using the chat box or the Q&A box. The chat box is also where you'll find links to some of Dr. Wallenstein's books. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Peter Wallenstein. Peter Wallenstein is a professor of history at Virginia Tech. His work emphasizes the South in general, and Virginia in particular, from the Civil War to civil rights. His research interests lie more specifically with race and marriage, as well as race and higher education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Wallenstein in conversation with Tricia Walker.
I'm delighted to be here. Let's play.
It's going to be great. So, do you want me to just start off with the first question that we have? And basically, if you had to give an elevator speech on why you wrote the book, what would you say?
Is this a 4-story building or a 40-story building?
Yeah, how about a 15-story building?
Okay, so when Mrs. Loving died 13 years ago now, I knew I had to be at her funeral. My wife and I drove close to 300 miles across the state, spent about 24 hours, I would say, in greater metropolitan Bowling Green, population 700 or thereabouts. Went to the funeral home the night before, the funeral the next day, the cemetery, and all kinds of things going on. Came back and was just chock full of impressions and thoughts and feelings that I had to register. So I kicked on the machine and started writing. And a day or two later, I had about maybe 20 pages. And I looked at that and I said, yep, that's what I had to say. Now what do I do with it? Looks like an epilogue. Epilogue comes at the end of a book. I guess I'd best get to the book.
That's great. So how would you set the stage as to what the lives of Mildred and Richard were like, what it would have been like in Carolina County for them?
Caroline County in the 1950s. She, by the time we pick up the story when they get married and get into all the trouble that they do, she's in her late teens, he's in his early 20s. They're kids who live in far eastern Caroline County. Now, you brush up against the county if you drive from Richmond to DC, or you could do it the other way around. But either way, you're a long way from where they grew up. I'm not going to say that they lived at the end of the world, but I will say that if you head out to eastern Caroline County and you look and you peer through the trees, the pine trees, you just might be able to see the end of the world from there. It's a very remote area. There's not a lot of people then or now living in that stretch of the county. Now, he everybody took to be a white man. She everybody understood to be not a white woman. So you understand the capital crime that they committed when they fell in love and thought they should get married. How they would have lived their lives had the law not intruded is that she would have spent her time as a mom and he would have spent his time during the weekdays at least, slapping down cement on bricks or cinder blocks and building houses for other people, and maybe one for himself, but that had to wait.
Yes, growing up in a rural county, I can visualize that beautifully.
Me too.
Would you say that the county was representative of Virginia or the US at the time?
I think it's a great question, and this is how I'm going to go at it. Everybody writing on this case, back when it was in the courts in the 1960s, and pretty much since, has taken it to be this truly exceptional enclave where race didn't count for anything, and Richard wouldn't be very much cognizant that the young lady he was courting wasn't white. Now, first of all, that's preposterous. He would have known in his bones growing up anywhere, certainly in Virginia, Eastern Virginia, that there was a racial difference there. The question is to what degree there was space in their social world to accommodate them that they couldn't have found anywhere else. And the way I answer that question is at odds with those people who said about the place that they grew up, that there wasn't much race consciousness, black and white, and it was always couched in those binary terms. They worked well together. They didn't mess in each other's lives. Of course, that already implies that they were separate lives. But, one reason I wrote this book, one reason that I had met Mildred Loving, had spoken with both the lawyers who took the case, is that I'd written an earlier book. I thought when I finished it, I was done with the project. I wasn't quite convinced, but I thought I was. And what I found was that there were cases like the Lovings scattered across space and time. You could find them from Maine to California. Both states had such laws on the books at one time. You could find them in Alabama or Tennessee or anywhere else. And specifically in Virginia, I was finding couples that had thought they could go off to DC, like many years later the Lovings would, and get married and bring their marriage back and not be messed with the law. And they turned out to find out, like the Lovings did, that this wasn't going to be true. But the fact was that they had created this life for themselves, right? For themselves already. And my favorite case comes from up in the Shenandoah Valley. Here's a couple who paid a very heavy fine. They contested it, went to the Virginia Supreme Court. The law was upheld. Their petition was turned back. They continued living with each other. They had 3 boys at that point. They had 2 more kids in the years that followed. It's not clear that after having paid their dues once, anybody ever called upon them to do it again. So I see it as unusual because it wasn't typical, after all, for people to marry across racial lines in this fashion. But it was not unusual for people to do that. And what happened in Caroline County wasn't so much that there was local hostility, though there was surely going to be some concern. It's that the law reached in. And the law was not enacted at the local level. This was a state law. It was on behalf of the state of Virginia. This was a crime against the Commonwealth. So it's not every place, but it's not unique.
So you mentioned in your book really 5 central characters. So there's obviously Richard and Mildred. There's also the lawyers Bernard Cohen and Philip
Hirschkopf.
And then the judge, Leon
Basile.
Basile.
These are all interesting characters. And you can't put this play on the stage without all 5 of them.
So as you dug into all of this history, what did you find most intriguing about each of them, their personalities, what they brought to the situation?
Richard was a laid-back, laconic, every rural kid who happened to be white and want to marry Mildred. He built houses, but those weren't his passion. That was his job. He was good at it. And eventually he'd put it to work once they got cleared by the Supreme Court of the United States. But he raced cars. We know this. And it was a multiracial racing team. He was the white kid among the group of 3. And all the pictures that we have taken of them, and they won time and again, those they date though from the 1960s. They don't date from the 50s. What drew the 2 of them together, how Richard came across Mildred in the first place and began to notice her, was that he stopped by to visit with her brothers because they were all into music and they played music together. So you got the race car driving, music making, rural kid builds houses and does other stuff. And then you got her. Now, she takes charge of the case. Without her, there is no case. It takes 2 of them first to marry, and then 2 of them to be committed to keeping that marriage under whatever conditions they could work out. But she's the one who, time and again, she writes the letter to the Justice Department, said, "Can you help us?" And she follows up with the lawyer that they point her to. And then a year later, when nothing seems to have happened, she's really quite pointed about following up yet again. Hope you hadn't forgotten us, she writes. She is a force. I loved her dearly. She's one of those people. And I should say it somewhat differently because it's not like they're a dime a dozen, but one of those people that you feel enormous admiration for and affection for. The book I thought might somebody observe in a review looked like a love letter from Peter Wallenstein to Mildred Loving. And that wouldn't fundamentally mischaracterize the book. I mean, she's the one who drew me to the story, and she's the one who made it possible. But the lawyers themselves, and this is one way to tell the story, they've been exiled. They've been sentenced to a year in prison, which is in fact the least possible amount once convicted, once they plead guilty, that they could have. They're given an option. You can go leave the state. You can be free, but not here. You can be married, but not in Virginia. So they go to DC, and several years pass, and finally a number of things combine. And she says, no, I'm going back. It's time. This doesn't work for me. So she's the one who leads the way. He's the loyal lieutenant who follows his general everywhere, but she's the general. Now we need to talk a little bit more about the two lawyers and the judge, but I see we have a question from the audience.
Yes. So Robert wrote in, and his question is that he knows this calls for speculation, but do you think the Virginia prosecutors and judges would have metered out a harsher sentence had Mr. Loving been Black and Mrs. Loving been white?
That is the great question. One of the two lawyers in particular, Bernard Cohen, the first to step into the story, he celebrated a number of things about a case that he saw as possibly going to the US Supreme Court. And if it got there, then it should be winnable. He loved the title of it. It would be Loving versus Virginia. I mean, you can't get better than that. He knew it going in, right? I mean, he loved Mrs. Loving, but he loved the name of the case that he would be taking. But he also thought that it would be an easier case to take all the way through, precisely because the guy was white. Now, so let's introduce Judge Leon Bazile, because the lawyers haven't come in yet. The local lawyer, and he's not to be trifled with, he's a former member of the House of Delegates. He's an old timer. He knows the judge knows him. They go to trial, and it's a plea deal, right? We plead guilty, and you'll do this that we've agreed upon. It has been said by otherwise reputable historians about the judge that he threw the book at them, that he gave them the maximum possible sentence. Well, if the maximum was 5 years and he gave him 1, it's hard to see how that, there's a certain divergence there, shall we say, between the two. He didn't even send them off to the penitentiary. He said they were going to be in the local jail. Now that would have terrorized Mildred herself, but at least she would have been somewhere near home and her daddy could have stopped by and visited her. But the fact that he gave them an option that the law really didn't permit, that they could forego the punishment if they only left his jurisdiction, if it moved out of Virginia, take their marriage someplace else. So he's actually letting them off in a real way. Now, I think I've answered the question, yeah. The chances are that the penalty would have been harsher. No question about that. It does call for speculation, but we can readily speculate that outcome. But let me put it to you that one of the things that the judge saw in his courtroom was a mixed marriage. Judge Bazile was in one himself. His papers are at the Virginia Historical Society. My wife and I spent several days going through these, enthralled by several years worth of correspondence between a young man from Virginia and a young woman from Alabama. That wasn't the mixed thing about their connection. But he was a Virginia Catholic and she was an Alabama Baptist. And he could see his way clear to marrying her, but she could not. And she wrote it time and again. We can never be anything but friends. World War I actually rescued the marriage, made it possible. Because when he got his draft notice, or went in for his physical, I guess it was, suddenly she realized with horror what it might be if she could never see him again. And so she came around. It took some negotiations. So that's one of the things he saw that I think may have softened his approach. And another was that he's looking at this small group of people in front of him. And we can, this is speculation on my part, right? There's the prosecuting attorney. There's the defending attorney, there's the judge, there's the two defendants. That's 5 people. But I'm also putting into the picture her mom, her dad, and by this point, 2 young kids, one in arms and the other a toddler. And he's thinking, why do I need to separate these 2 people from the kids? Why do I need to separate them from each other? Can't I find another way? Now, I think his own experience really helped him lead to this conclusion. But these are fascinating vignettes for me, either things that we can know or that we can think probable. His folks wouldn't have been there. Hers would have been. And little Donald, who'd been born in between the times, they were pregnant when they got married. And I could speak to that as well. Growing up in northern New England in the 1950s, like she did in Eastern Virginia in the 1950s, you know, when teenagers went together, sometimes it turned to sex, you understand? This is a family show, can I say that? And sometimes what happened was that one of them would get pregnant. And in effect, they would both see themselves as having gotten the signal that now's the time, tie the knot, make it official, make it permanent. But that was an option that Richard wasn't sure they had in Virginia, and that's why they went to DC. He thought they'd be okay. What do you mean by that? When she said to me, he thought they would be okay, that they'd be all right, that they wouldn't be prosecuted. What would they have been prosecuted for? Fornication, obviously. If she's pregnant, somebody's responsible for this. And this is sex out of marriage, regardless of race, but the race would have necessarily played into it, right? Mm-hmm. So there's all kinds of things going on. It was time for them to get married. That's what they thought they had done. Turned out they hadn't, or at least the laws said they hadn't. So let's see now. That 40 story, this is a different question, isn't it? I need to talk to you about these 2 lawyers. So they're both 30-somethings. They're both young. They're both fresh out of law school, each of them about 2 years at the time they move into the case. Bernard Cohen has no experience in federal court. He's never had anything to do with civil rights litigation. He knows he wants to help. The local ACLU in DC has assigned him the case, and will cover costs. But he is absolutely up the creek trying to figure out what to do. Now, somewhere along the line, he comes across a case that shows how it's possible to get a case that should have been resolved years ago, should be dead now, can't possibly bring it back to court, should be possible to bring it back to the trial court. And so he takes that approach. And of course, Judge Bazile pays him no mind whatever. Just absolutely ignores him. And Bertie Cohen has no clue what to do next. And finally, when Mrs. Loving, a year later, has written that second letter, and he says, I got to go talk to my constitutional law professor at the law school there in DC. And so he goes to visit, and they're talking when another more recent graduate, Phil Hirschkopf, stops by to visit his old con law professor. Now, Phil Hirschkopf is a force of nature. He said to me one time, you know, Wallenstein, I didn't get to be 80 years old and doing the things I do without having been a Green Beret. He got out of high school, and I think it was 53, went straight into special forces. Later, did undergraduate work. Later went to law school, and later, not much later, almost immediately, found himself on the front lines of the civil rights struggle in the Deep South in federal court, defending black and white civil rights workers who had been brought in all kinds of charges. So this is the accident that brings them together. Cohen works solo for a year. Hirschkopf is so intrigued. He is, Bernie, Mr. Cohen, what you working on? So Cohen tells him, not probably in the earnest way you see in the movie, but you get a sense, and he's intrigued. You know, he wants a piece of this action, and he knows he can help out. He sees what feckless fool Cohen is. His heart is in the right place, but he's got no head for it. Hirschkopf has both the heart and the head, and especially the head. And so they team up. The case never could have been brought to a successful conclusion with only Cohen and not Hirschkopf, but it never would have been there at all without Hirschkopf. It takes both. It really, really does. So there we get a sense of our 5 people.
Now, a little off script, but you'd mentioned that his parents would not have been there. So is there a sense of his parents at all in the story, where they stood, how they supported or didn't support?
They, I think, weren't amused. If he wanted to go with a colored girl, I suppose he's of age, he can do that. But he doesn't need to bring her home. He doesn't need to marry her. I think that was how they would have said it, how they would have seen it.
Mhm.
Now, eventually, his mom comes around, and she's omnipresent, or she's often present, I should say, in photos that are taken of the family in the mid-60s. And she clearly has adopted the kids as her own. She is the granny. These are her grandkids. She has come around, but it took a revolution on her part in her thinking to get to that point. She did not start out there.
Yes, and I just saw a question pop up. So Hannah, would you like to?
We have a question about Cohen and Hirschkopf from Coral. She asks, were Cohen and Hirschkopf Jewish, and do you think that could have impacted them taking on the case?
Yes, they were Jewish, and yes, I think that may well have. There's no question that among the white allies of Black defendants in all kinds of cases, as well as on the front lines in all kinds of civil rights demonstrations, a young Jewish man was much more likely to identify with Black civil rights workers, no matter who they were and what the particular situation, than were their Protestant or Catholic counterparts. That's not to say that there weren't white allies from both those other camps. But if you think about the 3 young men who were pulled out of an earth dam in Philadelphia, Mississippi in the summer of '64, at just about the time this case was going into the courts, one was the local Black kid, the other 2 were Northern Jewish men. So it's a great question. I do think that there was far greater receptivity there. But there were definitely Catholic allies, white allies as well, including one group in particular that signed on as a friend of the court in support of the Lovings when the case went to the Supreme Court.
So in chapter 8 of the book, you explore the impact of the case on family patterns and popular culture by briefly looking at a variety of films and the stereotypes and prejudices that those illustrated. You also discussed various stories which retell the Loving story. So with all that in mind, are there any particular films that you would recommend more than others, ones that you think people should be aware of and maybe make an opportunity to view?
Well, some of you will no doubt know about the so-called documentary and then the later feature film. What you are far less likely to know about is a lovely film from the late 90s called Mr. and Mrs. Loving, which was precisely the issue, of course, whether they could ever be. I saw that first movie, first chronologically, years ago, and I was just so taken with it. It is a sweet film about a hard topic. The acting is delicious. The scenes are plausible. The scholarship is nil. At that point, I had written big law review article on the case, but there's no reason to think that anybody who wasn't in law school, and not most of them either, would have ever had occasion to come across it. There really wasn't any scholarship to draw upon. There was remarkably little to work with, but it was a fabulous story. And so clearly the filmmakers and the actors as well were drawn to it. And it's really, really nice. I don't remember it very well. I do remember that it's flagrantly fictitious in that it chooses to use a subtitle for the time in 1960. I believe it was 1960. It was clearly after any of the action could have taken place. They were already married, already arrested, already convicted and exiled and living in DC by the time that it says they're just now meeting up, what looks to be for the first time in some time, like he's just coming back from a stint in the army, which was entirely plausible, but I don't think introduced. So there's one that I would recommend, even though it's almost all fiction. It's based upon a true story, very loosely based upon a true story, and it's delightfully done, especially by the actress who plays Mildred. Now, if anybody can identify a fourth film, you get a gold star, 100 in the course, not just for today, but for the entire course. And this is a film that was never made, but was very much intended. And many of you, if you saw either of the two films, have seen it at work. So Hope Ryden wanted to make a film. She's a young lady in the 60s, and she spends a lot of time with the Lovings. And this is moving picture, this isn't stills. And she's asking questions and Mildred's responding to them. And in fact, this is how we can know some of the information that Mildred divulged. And it's how we can know what she would have sounded like so that the actress in the feature film could know exactly what Mildred said and how she would have sounded. So a film that no one has ever seen. They've nonetheless seen it directly by the millions, right? That film is also used in the so-called documentary, and to very good advantage. And if it hadn't been for the director of that film, that footage would have been thrown out, I imagine, when Hope Ryden died, because she'd parked it in a closet. It was something she tried to do, and nothing came of it. She moved on in her life and did all kinds of other things. But if we talk about the two much more recent films, the documentary has several redeeming characteristics. One of them is that you see Bernie Cohen, for example, or Phil Hirschkopf, or the youngest of the three loving children, Peggy. You see them way back when, so Peggy's an urchin, and both the lawyers are very young men, and you see them again now. And you see them from time to time in Hope Ryden's filmage that gets imported into the film. And it's marvelous. I mean, that's really serious value added to get to see Bernie Cohen and Phil Hirschkopf each separately commenting on what they make of looking back, what they did, or what the Lovings brought about. The feature film, it's fictional in some respects, but it's scrupulously based upon a true story. It's written by someone who took the story seriously and who wanted to get it right. And kudos to him. I had a long conversation with him at the governor's mansion while that film was still in production. And it's where too that I met, not Mildred, the original I'd met, but the new one with Nega, who was playing her so effectively. I came into the building and I looked across the hall and I saw Ruth at the far end, and I paid no mind to anybody else. I made a beeline for her. She wasn't busy at the time. I was going to make her busy. And she was in costume and character as herself, that is to say, Mrs. Loving. And I was in costume and character as myself, which is Peter Wallenstein. And we had this absolutely enchanting conversation about what was going on with the film, how it was coming along. And I don't remember now what she might have asked me or any of that kind of thing. I do remember some of that with the actor playing Richard Loving, and I do remember some of that with the director. But it was just a magnificent conversation. And the fact was, she could know, as I've said, because of Hope Ryden's much, 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 much earlier work. Who Mrs. Loving would have been, how she would have carried herself, what kind of language she would have spoken, what her voice would have sounded like. And it's a magnificent voice. When you see Ruth Negga replicate it, imagine yourself that is actually Mildred speaking. My first conversation with Mildred was not in person, it was on phone. And I was scribbling and taking notes desperately as she told me her story. We got to follow up later, but I fell in love with the voice, quite aside from the story. The combination was truly powerful.
So you
see the feature film, See Loving. I won't hold it against you, and you shouldn't either if you go and see the so-called documentary. The documentary, as I say, it brought in Hirschkopf and Cohen and Peggy talking about those times. It retrieved that lost footage. That's really, really important. So it kind of revived the story. It truly did. It took Mrs. Loving's death to call to people's attention that there was a story out there than to follow up on. And that's where both of these films came from.
So you've mentioned Hope. There was also an individual, Gray
Vallette. He's a South African who washes up on shore in the US. He's a crackerjack photographer, mostly working during this stretch of time with Life magazine. And I no longer remember, to the extent I might have known at one point, to what extent he's assigned this task, or he just wheedles the opportunity to go off and pursue the story. Mm-hmm. You see him in the feature film. You see him in Loving, where he shows up, and unlike Hope Ryden, he gets a name and a face and a personality. He gets some speaking lines, and then he ambles off like a young colt to spend time with Mrs. Loving. And he is as taken with her as anybody else I've described. And he gets these fabulous photos, which themselves lend themselves directly to the film. In fact, the very last scene in the film is when you see an actual Gray Vallette photo of a scene that you've just seen acted out on screen, right? One of the very, very few light moments, very few moments of absolute hilarity in the entire film. Richard is always looking like he's terrorized, beaten down, and there they are watching a TV show and just cracking up, loving being together, loving watching the show, happy as all get out, free at last.
So in thinking about what Vallette and Ryden did and the fact that they captured this information, could you talk a little bit about how sometimes people capture things and they're so useful to historians at a later date?
Yeah, I mean, the film itself, I published this book clearly before the feature film came out, but both of us, the writer, director, and I, depended on the material that was generated back in the 60s. Now, Gray Vallette, when he took those photos, it was for a spread in Life magazine. That was a widely distributed magazine at the time. Huge numbers of people got to see it. And so you got not only to see the images, but the story behind them. It brought the whole story to a huge national population, right? It became something of a mass event in itself. So at the time it made a splash, but it made it possible for me to tell the story later on. You know, having the voices of the people who lived the lives you're trying to recount is so critical if you have access to them. So when Mrs. Loving could tell me what it was when they got busted in on that night, I went up to my mom's room and I sat on the bed. And I'm not going to try to replicate her voice here. What should I do? Well, you really don't have a choice, honey. You got to go with them, you know. But she's describing this whole horrific moment that seared into her memory. That all those years later, this was the horrific moment of her life. There were companion pieces, to be sure, that came in the years that followed. I mean, you have to understand, I think, try to understand the horror, the terror of the 6 months between the arrest and the trial, when they really know They're beginning to come to grips with the fact that they could be separated from each other and sent off to prison for 5 years. No contact with each other or little Donald or anybody else. She wouldn't get to see her mom or her beloved sister or dad. I mean, just cut off. So, I mean, she had a number of seriously malevolent moments, but that was the one that stands out, and it's the one that led to those others.
So the final question I have is, at the end of your book, you briefly discussed same-sex marriage in relation to the Lovings case. In light of all the societal changes that have happened since you wrote the book, what would you add now, or topics you would explore now that you didn't at that time?
The first book came out in 2002. Its title is taken directly from what Bernie Cohen said to the Supreme Court that Richard Cohen had told him, that Richard Loving had told him. Just tell the court I love my wife, right? And it's not fair, but we can't live together there in Virginia. Just tell the court I love my wife. So Tell the Court I Love My Wife is the title of that book. And I finish off a section at the end of that book tells the story about how as early as 1970, so within 3 years of the Loving ruling, some same-sex couples were seeking to take the language and logic as they saw it of Loving and apply it to their own situation. The first case came out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Minnesota never had such a law in the books about race, but it did have all the usual restrictions about gender. And that case, like the others that soon followed in Pennsylvania, Washington State, Kentucky, and there was another, New York, they were basically laughed out of court. And what the judge in each case would rule is that, look, the court ruled that race could no longer be used, but it left intact all the powers that any state ever had to govern who gets to marry whom. Can first cousins marry, what restrictions should there be? So they said they're having none of it. And then years passed, all the way through the 80s, nothing happened. And then in the 90s, a different approach was taken, first in Hawaii, then in Alaska, arguing not from the 14th Amendment, but arguing from the state constitution. There's a provision in there about equal rights that could readily be construed, how could it not, they argued, to take away this inhibition against, this restriction against our getting married. Now, what happened in both Hawaii, which is a fairly well-known situation, and Alaska, which is its younger sister kid clone, in both cases, the electorate immediately changed the language of the Constitution so it could no longer be interpreted in this fashion, right? To expressly ban such marriages. But things were beginning to roll. There was pushback to an enormous extent. The Defense of Marriage Act in '96 said no state needed to recognize such a marriage took place anywhere else. That's one of the things it did. But Vermont, there the court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. Not that you could immediately go out and get married, but that the legislature has been told it has to enact new legislation. It doesn't have to call it marriage. You can call it civil union, which was precisely the language immediately embraced both there and elsewhere. And wherever the concept of, or the term marriage drew fire, civil union became kind of the center of political gravity. It became far more acceptable. It was an entering wedge of a sort. It certainly was, but before very long, by 2003, so shortly after my first book had come out, the Massachusetts Supreme Court said, no, you can't just require that it be called something else. If it's equal, then it's marriage, and call it that. And so Massachusetts now pushes the process along. Well, just as Massachusetts came after my first book, what the Supreme Court did with regard to same-sex marriage came very shortly after my second book. What I did in that book was tell the story of what had happened since. So Massachusetts and variety of cases in courts, but increasingly moving toward legislation. So representing something of the will of the political majority, not just what a court says about how to construe a constitutional phrase. I created two scenarios, both of which struck me as hugely plausible as to how a case would come before the US Supreme Court. Neither one, it turned out, needed to happen. And my expectation that it might take 2, 3, 3.5 years to get there also turned out to be entirely too long. But where the second book leaves off is on the cusp of something that could happen, might very likely, and this is how it likely will. The actual path was a little different, but the results much the same. Anna, I see we have another question.
Yes, we have a couple audience questions. And before I jump into the audience questions, I just want to say quickly, if you have questions for Dr. Wallenstein, feel free to put those in the chat box or the Q&A box. He is happy to take your questions. Our first question comes from Colleen, who asks, we know interracial marriage was illegal, but what about interracial divorce? Was there such a thing since the marriage portion was
okay,
legal?
so two great ways to approach this, it seems to me. First of all, while the Lovings were in their turmoil, another couple in Virginia, one party wanted a divorce. The other was not keen on it, so contested it. It went into the courts, it went to the Virginia Supreme Court. Effectively, we're told you can't get a divorce in the state because you don't have a marriage that we recognize in the state. So their New Jersey marriage, they were going to have to go back to New Jersey if they wanted to break it up. You know, they couldn't do it. Now, to take the question seriously in a way that had much broader application, most states that had such laws, and most states had such laws, would declare such a marriage void. You can't possibly divorce somebody if you don't have a valid marriage. Richard was quoted in one of, in part of what Pope Bryden captured him in, saying, I'm not going to divorce her. Well, dude, you can't divorce her. You don't have a marriage, right? I mean, what he was saying, of course, was that he was not going to walk away from this thing. That she might lead the charge, but he was going to be there in support of it all the way. This was not something that anybody was going to break up. They were going to do everything they could, everything within their power to keep the marriage. So he's not saying they're going to be, but it's his own way, without the legal niceties of saying, I'm sticking with this thing. Now, there are ways that could have played out that will take more time than perhaps we have. So you can ask me about that in a minute, but let's go back to that other question. To say about it, as almost everybody does, that interracial marriage was illegal before 1967, misses the boat in two profound ways. For one thing, lots of states, not most, but lots of states never had such laws to start with. And half of the states that had such laws had by 1967 repealed them or had them thrown out by the courts, which was less often. So you could have readily, when Mildred Loving dies, all kinds of people write into the funeral home. And that gave me rich material that I used in the epilogue to that book. And one of them says, you know, my husband and I live in New York. Now we're free to move to Virginia if we want to, right? It's one of the ways that I say about that case that it freed everybody. That nobody could reach into your background and say, you didn't know it, but you have a great-great-grandmother who, okay, all the terrorist organizations that were out there, including individuals who had all kinds of incentives to cause trouble and typically had in the past and no longer could. So interracial marriage was not everywhere illegal, but it was by 1967 when the court rules. There are still 16 states, 15 besides Virginia. The entire former Confederacy, the entire former, and several other states, and we can detail those if anybody wants to. But even in Virginia, interracial marriage was not illegal. An ethnic Chinese could marry an American Indian, you know, so Rappahannock Japanese pairing would be perfectly legal in Virginia. It would have been outlawed in Texas. Anyway, it gets complicated. At the margins, it becomes really complicated, but most people lived at the margins. And the question was, was there such a law? And did it apply to me? And if I flaunted it, what might happen, right? So great question. But the short answer then is you can't get divorced if you don't have a valid marriage. But maybe, just maybe, you'll escape penalties if you walk away from your marriage and act as though it never happened, right? And that's in effect what people are time and again being encouraged to do, including the Lovings. But I really wanted to square that thing about interracial marriage, right? Because one of the arguments actually raised by the Lovings lawyers before the Supreme Court was that this is not a racial integrity act that's being enforced here. Is the people who presume a white racial identity are acting in a way that they want to preserve that. They don't want anybody slipping in, but they don't give a rat's ass about anybody else, right? Black can marry Indian, no problem. And in fact, Mrs. Loving herself embodies precisely that mix.
You talked about this a little bit in your last answer, but I'll ask it anyway. You might have another take on it. Coral writes in to ask, did the Supreme
Sorry, Carl, you already had your question.
Did the Supreme Court decision strike down Virginia's law or all state laws banning interracial marriage? So I guess in other words, once the Supreme Court got a hold of Loving versus Virginia, did that affect only Virginia or was that nationwide? And if it was only Virginia, how long did it take states to remove that from their books?
It was very clear that this law would have application to any state that still had such laws, that this ruling would be universal. So immediately it applied, in theory at least, to Texas and Mississippi and Florida and Georgia and so on. In practice, it didn't. That is to say, that time and again, I'll use Alabama as a really good example, people would refuse to issue marriage licenses either out of personal prejudice or because they understood themselves still to be subject to state law and they did not want to get themselves hit with a felony indictment for flouting the state law that said they couldn't do this thing they were about to do, right? And so either way, that case is going to make its way into federal district court. Either way, federal district court, when the case comes before it, is going to rule, no, actually Loving takes you off the hook. It does not make it possible for you to act out your private prejudice, and it does not make it necessary for you to fret about whether your liberty is in jeopardy. It took several years to work it out. It took 3+ years in Alabama. It took less time in Mississippi and Georgia and some other states where this was true. But you saw much the same thing with same-sex marriage, right? When the court ruled, nonetheless, there were county clerks of court who said, no, not on my watch. And they quite clearly appeared to be acting out of their own private convictions and not out of any sense of being beholden to a state law that said they shouldn't.
I was about to say, I'm from Kentucky. You were giving me flashbacks there to a certain high-profile county clerk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those kind of clerks are still there. And in Kentucky, it's still required of you, if you wish to get married, that you fill out a form that in which you must certify your racial identity. For what it's worth, that case, that situation is currently being contested. And I think it will get thrown out. But then I only have so much faith in judges, depending on who they were appointed or elected by. So what was I going to say? Oh yeah, the other piece I wanted to introduce was a complication that always escapes attention. Everybody says about the court's ruling that it was unanimous. And there's no question that it was. That is to say, as far as the couple who claimed to be Mr. and Mrs. Loving, the court rules these convictions must be overturned. But only 8 members of the court signed on to what can either be perceived as the court decision or a majority ruling, because one member of the court chose to sign on to the must overturn convictions, but all he did was repeat language from a somewhat similar case from 3.5 years ago that had made loving a lot easier to reach. He did not for the life of him see how the racial identity of an actor could render the act by that person criminal, right? The act was criminal or it was not. It was not contingent on how you identify or how you are identified. Now, if we take seriously the approach that he appears to have preferred, then what the court would have been ruling is that these convictions must be overturned. They might even have ruled that in Virginia, no, that's not there. So now we imagine the Lovings are delighted. They move back to Eastern Caroline County. And 4 weeks later, their door gets busted down. They get hauled off to the same skanky jail. Why? Has nothing to do with race. Nothing but ever to do with race. You two are clearly living together and you ain't married. That is not a race-specific charge. And so there would have been another conviction. And another case to go through the litigation process. Or I'm imagining, not trained as a lawyer, I'm imagining that there would have been a way to fast track this case to get it to the Supreme Court to say, no, actually, you can't do that. But it's not clear. It muddies the waters tremendously. By taking so it goes back actually to the concerns that the two lawyers were very clearly concerned, here Hirschkopf in particular, about two things. One, that if they won a partial victory, and it goes back to the trial judge, and he does what he's told to do now. The state Supreme Court has already said you can't exile them. That's not on the table. His options are 1 to 5. And they were concerned that there'd be a narrow gauge kind of thing that would not reach all the panoply of laws across all 16 states. 17 when they argued it, but Maryland had pulled away by June that year. So you can imagine 4 just absolutely delirious people when the court issues its ruling. Mr. and Mrs. Loving and 2 lawyers who had jeopardized their clients by taking their case and hoping to win. With that fact that they won, and big time. That's why we celebrate this case, right? That's why it is so far reaching, so significant. For years, my wife would see an obviously mixed race couple, didn't matter the combination, and she'd say, oh, look, a loving couple. The case freed everybody. It truly did. Mrs. Loving made it happen. Mr. Loving had to help. Mr. Cohen made it happen. Mr. Hirschkopf had to be there. Chief Justice Earl Warren and his brethren had to sign on. I mean, it took a village, right? It took a lot of villages.
So that's actually our last audience question. I'd like to take an opportunity to ask you one final question before we wrap up. And that is there anything that didn't come up tonight that you want to touch on?
Well, in one way or another, I think we've touched on an awful lot of the things that lie in the background of the story, right? I mean, these are just 2 kids growing up in the backcountry who want to get married, but it could have been in a city. It could have been any racial mix. It could have been anything that was banned by law. It could have been any time or place. And one reason we know this is because it was so many times and places. I mean, that would have been a thin book if I wrote about one short chapter on one case and had nothing to put in all the other chapters, right? And then the book that we're talking about tonight, I was really quite intent while focusing my attention on the Loving story, placing it in these larger contexts of time and space. So they would be clear what lay back of all of this. And in some respects address that question, that great question about, so how special a place was this? How representative, right? Is this something that happened time and again? And the answer is yes. And one reason it could is that people didn't necessarily see themselves as hostile members of warring tribes where they could never cross those boundaries. There might be doubt, of course, too, as to where the boundary lay, as to who was on which side of it. Time and again, you get efforts to say, well, but no, I'm actually on that side. I still remember a story years ago. Someone told me about how he knew somebody from his family who lived in Baltimore. The law said they couldn't marry. He was white, she was not. And so he declared himself Black. And they lived happily ever after, far as the body can tell, right? But this has to do, again, with the magic, whether benign or malign, of trying to navigate these kinds of concerns. And once they've been taken off the table, once they're no longer there, then now you're free to work out who you're going to be. And Mrs. Loving could decide how she wanted to identify herself. And that's something we actually didn't talk about, right? When she died, everybody made her out to be a Black woman. Not to malign anybody who identifies as a Black woman. There are lots of people who do that. And she happened to be one of them sometimes. But she also had other identities. And she was insistent, as people rightly are, that she shouldn't be defined by somebody else. Now, the state didn't care whether she was Black or Indian, or any kind of mix, Black, white, Black, Indian, Black, white, Indian, it didn't matter. She was, under the law, a colored woman. That was the technical category under which she could not escape. I mean, that's where she was confined. She didn't identify herself as a colored woman. She knew with more particularity about her lineage, and so she could say about herself, as she did when she applied for her marriage license, she's Indian. She could, as she did when she wrote Mr. Cohen, I am part Indian and part Negro. And I was pondering just the other day, and I think it was this upcoming conversation that had me thinking about it. What was it that lay behind
It's 8 o'clock.
her thinking about how to present? That's my computer, it tells me that. It says it's time for me to take a drink. So what was it that led her to pick that identity? And it occurred to me, and I don't think it had before, that when they went to DC, and clearly there might be some concern about their racial identities, it goes back to an earlier question. He's going to be white. Maybe it'll make it easier for us to get our license if I called myself Indian. I think it entirely plausible. It doesn't say that she didn't identify Indian, but if she has to pick if it's 2021 at state of Kentucky and she wants to get married, she has to pick an identity, right? And so that's the one she picked. Now, Hirschkopf in particular always wanted to take the case and frame it in terms of the civil rights struggle that was largely understood in terms of the Black-white binary. So he wasn't going to be interested in how she wanted to identify herself as Indian, because that really was not, for his purposes, germane. Cohen never could quite learn that about her. Well as he thought he knew her, even at her funeral, he asked me, did I think she thought she was Indian? Well, dude. Yeah, she did. Now, here's a story that may be a good way to wrap things up, right? They had 3 kids. Well, we know that she had 3. I'm unsure about him. The oldest kid was the darkest of the 3 when you see a picture of the 3. And his name throughout his life was always, his last name was Loving. His last name was Jeter. Now, this goes off in all kinds of directions. When the drunk driver plowed through a stop sign, as Mrs. Loving described it to me, and then I went to the scene and saw there was more directly head on. It's a very sharp angle. Just came straight through. Richard died on the spot. Mildred was fairly seriously injured, something she lived with the rest of her life. A wrongful death suit went forward. Bernie Cohen represented Mrs. Loving. After the resolution, which included a cash payment, that was going to be made available to each of the three kids when they turned 18. They had to go back in to fix it because oldest son was named Loving, and that wasn't his name. Okay, so as roughly 20-somethings, older than their mom had been when she got married, but younger than their dad in between, all three in birth order get married. They all go to Caroline County Courthouse and fill out an application. Every one of them specifies the identity of their going-to-be spouse. And in oldest son's name, on oldest son's form, it's Negro. On middle son's form, it's white. On youngest daughter's form, it's Indian. They had married the rainbow, and their mom had made it possible. And Peggy, to this day, knows that's true. In her own way, she says what I say, that it freed everybody, right? Now, how did the three kids identify? Indian, Indian, Indian. So within the rainbow of possibilities in Caroline County, they had married everybody. And they were going to be who they were going to be, who their mom had said she was. Even though they knew that wasn't entirely true, it was true enough. I've been known to say on many occasions that we're all mongrels, get used to it. And just don't take it personal, just don't take it, just that's the way it is. By whatever mix, you know, Judge Bazile's kids were mongrels. They grew up in a mixed household, Catholic and Baptist, and they had to work out an arrangement in advance as to schooling and church attendance and so on. These come with the territory. Any two people that are going to get together, regardless of any details, whatever about them, we know in our bones that they're going to have to negotiate this thing. What the law made it monumentally more difficult for the couple who would be Mr. and Mrs. Loving to do was that they said they couldn't do it in the first place. And they eventually proved them all wrong. And so from that perspective, at least, the world is now 50 states of it, plus a free place. Thank you, Mrs. Loving. Thank you, Mr. Loving. Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Thank you, Mr. Hirschkopf.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wallenstein, and thank you, Tricia, for being our interviewer. Tricia is our branch manager at the Local History Special Collections branch. Another librarian at Local History Special Collections will be joining me on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, same bat time, same bat channel here on Zoom at 7 p.m. Leslie will be going over a program we're calling A Fresh Look at Genealogy Basics. So if you've ever wanted to dive into the world of genealogy and learn what resources you can use that from the library or what other resources are available to you, please join us. We'd love to have you. Tricia, do you have any final words for our audience?
Only, feel free to come and visit us at Local History. We'd love to have people come in, and we have a lot of people doing genealogy. So please come and visit.
Yeah, people, check out that Wednesday night program, okay? I use these tools all the time. I use them in part to track Mrs. Loving's genealogy best I could, to track her back to a free colored family from the 1850s. As one strand.
For those who want to come visit you at Local History, where can they find Local History?
So we're located at 717 Queen Street. We're within or co-located with the Barrett branch. We are encouraging appointments, but we are also accepting walk-ins, at least while we're still working with capacity levels. But there's many ways to contact us in advance to help figure out what your research is and how you should go about it. So we have an email, we have reference forms online. You can call us at our reference desk. Many ways to contact us, and please, really feel free to contact us and bring those questions in.
And when people come into the library, how much are they at risk to learn the story about the Alexandria Public Library in the summer of 1939 when a sit-in took place.
First known civil rights sit-in in United States history took place at Barrett Branch Library. You too can walk the steps where it happened. If you go visit Trish at Local History, you'll see in the chat box a link to the Local History Special Collections website where you can see all the ways to contact Local History, make an appointment, or their hours for walk-ins. Thank you, Tricia, so much for joining us tonight. And Dr. Wallenstein, do you have any final words for our audience?
Go and be free.
Thank you, everyone who joined us on this random Monday night for a great program about a little bit of Virginia history. And thank you to our speaker for taking time out of his busy schedule to sit with us this hour.
And thank you for being my class this evening.
All right, everyone, have a wonderful evening. Good night.